this place is a huge venue, right? And they've had some success when there's been big tournaments here. But the problem you have with this space is how do you monetize it when there's nothing going on? Is the esports bubble about to burst? Answer is yes. Players are paid far too much for far little. Advertisers suspect esports is an unsustainable Ponzi scheme. I wouldn't go that far. That's pretty intense. Teams are operating at a loss just to get into leagues. Yep. Companies are reporting dodgy and inflated viewership numbers. Yep. Sponsors and venture capitalists are pouring money in. MMORPGs are already predisposed to thinking duh right now. I know. We've already watched the esports fad raise parts of our genre to the ground as studios desperately try to mold MMO for esports and divert money away from online games towards things like esports stadiums. So yeah, I mean, esports bubble is definitely a bubble. For exactly the reasons that are laid out right here. Advertisers suspect esports is unsustainable, which is true. Players are paid far too much. Yep, that's true. Teams are operating at a loss to get into leagues. Yep. And VCs are donating insane amounts of money while companies report inflated viewership numbers. So yeah, it's like pretty objectively true that esports is a meme. Or I don't know like how to. So what's going to happen? I don't know like how to put this into like the real question is, does it matter, right? Because if esports is a bubble, then what's going to happen is a correction. And I actually said yesterday there would be a correction in esports in the next 2 years that would be pretty serious. And then after that, I think advertising budgets and sponsorship budgets even out and player salaries even out. So it's like people don't want to see esports undergo like a correction like this. And I understand that, but it's not a bad thing. Like players are getting paid way too much right now. And esports teams are not sustainable and businesses have to make sense so that everything makes sense. Comcast Arena is a very weird decision. Yeah, super weird. Like I can't, how much was that investment? $50 million in South Philadelphia. $50 million in $50 million in Philadelphia. Okay? $50 million in Philadelphia. Why does he keep saying that? Because holy shit, they can't even fill up the fucking LCS on a weekend. And they think that they can invest $50 million in Philadelphia and actually get people to go there. That is an actual insane meme. This is how you know that there's a bubble. So you think franchise esports leagues are unsustainable. LCS, the new COD thing. Yes. But you have to think very long term. 10 to 15 years, maybe not. But right now with the current expenditure to investment in, absolutely unsustainable. Yes. Most likely the initial investors to all these leagues will not ever see their ROI. It will be the people that come after them. 3,500 seat venue dubbed the Fusion Arena will have more than 2,000 square feet of LED screens, training facilities, and private rooms so players can stream video to their fans. The project is a joint venture with Baltimore's Cordish companies, will be located under the same venues where the city's other professional sports teams play. Beyond competitive gaming, it's a stunning facility that will host a wide array of events, said Chief Executive of Comcast Spectator, the company's stadium management business. The company was one of the dozen operators paying a $20 million franchise fee in the inaugural season of the Overwatch League, which plays the Activision Blizzard Inc. shooting title. Feels bad, man. I pay Comcast every month for internet, and what do they use it on? They spend $20 million plus $50 million, so $70 million total on making freaking owl investments in esports arenas that aren't gonna freaking work. Okay, so here's the problem, right? Look at all, like, let's not even look at, like, the Philadelphia arena, because that's just, like, way too much of a meme. I shouldn't even have to explain why that's a meme, right? And this goes into the esports as a bubble thing. The whole reason why there's a problem here is because nerds don't want to leave their homes, okay? So let's start there. If I tell you, let's get on Discord with the boys and have a friend group and watch League of Legends, that is infinitely more compelling to me to chill in my house, talk to my friends on Discord, and watch a game than it is for me to go to a stadium, buy overpriced hot dogs, and sit in a chair that sucks, and then have an enormous amount, and this is the problem that esports really has trouble solving, right, is the downtime between events, where there's a 10 to 20 minute downtime between games, and the audience is just sitting there, where like literally they're either doing the wave or they're hitting beach balls or whatever. There's no like halftime show or whatever, and like that doesn't really fit into the idea of esports. So the idea of esports being in stadiums never really sat with me that well in the first place. And yeah, I know like IEM and Worlds and all that stuff, and it's like really cool. There are use cases for it. But the problem is when these NFL and NBA guys come in here and they say, oh, the people right now go to see sports games just like they'll go to see esports games on every weekend. And just the stats don't show that, right? So if you look at any of the popular places in Los Angeles, which I think is the best example of this, okay? So if this business model is going to work, it's going to work in Los Angeles. So you have the LCS, which is a very low ticket price to get into the LCS. What is it, like $10? LCS happens mostly every weekend except when they're off season, and they rarely, like if ever, on non-important day games, fill that up. Some people go see it, but it's like 100 to 200 seats. It's not like tens of thousands, like a $50 million arena. There's these other things like Esports Arena, right? So Esports Arena in where is it? It's in Orange County, Santa Ana. The Esports Arena, right? This place is a huge venue, right? And they've had some success when there's been big tournaments here. But the problem you have with this space is, how do you monetize it when there's nothing going on? Because you can't get an event in here every day. And this kind of investment, this kind of like problem leads to the whole idea of the esports bubble, right? There's a lot of stupid money in esports right now, both in paying for franchise leagues, buying teams, paying players, which just outright just don't deserve their salaries, which sounds so terrible for me to say, right? Like, I don't mean the player themselves doesn't deserve it. What I mean is there's no market for that person, right? A player shouldn't be earning $500K a year if their actual ROI to the business is like negative 100 a year, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. The player needs to be earning that money back for that to make sense. So there's a hell of a lot of very stupid money in esports right now. And that's why esports is pretty obviously a bubble. When I say bubble, what I mean is esports is going to undergo a correction in the next 2 to 4 years. And then after that, it's probably going to flatten out. And we'll see advertising revenue and player salaries start to make more sense. There are other parts of esports where players are getting paid almost nothing, and then that doesn't make sense, and they're actually providing more ROI. So there's no definitions in this market. It's all just this big wild, wild west. And as long as that exists, yeah, there needs to be a correction. There needs to be something that actually turns up and makes sense, because right now, esports just doesn't make sense. A $50 million investment into an esports arena in Philadelphia doesn't make sense, and it's not the first thing I've heard to that end. The problem is, if you invest $30 million in a Series A for a esports team, and you expect a 4 to 5 times ROI on that return, like a standard VC does, how exactly are you going to get that return, right? You're basically expecting $120 million to appear out of $30 million. So how does that happen? Well, the only way it really happens is sponsorships and advertising fees. But sponsorships and advertisers are becoming less confident with esports, not more confident, because esports teams are not converting very well on paper. When you look at what esports teams can actually do to convert very well to their audiences, it's not very impressive. So if you're sponsored by some kind of product and that product markets through its esports players, the conversion from those esports players is far less than from influencers. So if you give it to me, or you give it to like a Lyric or like someone like that, we are going to convert that product much better than an esports team will convert that product. So why not just sponsor individual influencers? And you're seeing this happen, right? This is going to get into the realm of things that I can't talk about, but I'll just have to ask you to trust me when I say that many, many advertisers are pulling out of their sponsorship deals with esports teams, and they're pulling towards influencers. Because, okay, I have two options. I can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to advertise with a whole esports team, or I can put a fraction of that towards a single influencer with 10,000 concurrent viewers. And then those 10,000 concurrent viewers get exposed to my product with someone that they personally know, like, and trust. What sounds like a better value proposition? So esports, understanding this, has moved into a very interesting section, very awkward place, where esports teams are like kind of sort of influencer management companies. Esports teams, in a way, are kind of no different than Nerd Fusion, except that they just kind of like have players compete in tournaments. But the value of your esports team is defined by your influencers, your brand, right? And to some extent, like your actual overarching brand, but that most esports teams don't have great overarching brands like 100 Thieves or TL does. Most esports teams have a pretty weak central brand, and they have strong influencers on the team. That matters because if they don't have strong influencers, there's no reason to expect that those people are going to be able to convert those products at any reasonable rate, right? If I give a product to half the people on CLG right now, probably very few people will buy it because nobody really knows, likes, and trusts and identifies with those influencers. But if I give it to a team on Twitch like Dan's Gaming or Giant Waffle, they'll convert insanely well. So selling brands is easier and cheaper right now in the influencer space than it is in esports. Esports is forced to compare to influencers if they want to compete, which is a really bad place to be. Simultaneously, though, as if that wasn't enough, you would see a situation where a lot of this dumb money is going in. So whatever the amount of money that people are claiming for these OWL slots, which is somewhere between like 20 or 15 to $25 million, there's no way that you're going to get an ROI from OWL in that way. How could it possibly be otherwise? Who would sponsor OWL for millions of dollars a year right now when they can just sponsor influencers and they can have a much better ROI? Nobody will do that, right? And that's why OWL and League of Legends and CSGO are having trouble getting sponsors. Now, this is irregardless of how difficult it is for these guys to get sponsors because they're not brand friendly. So if you look at like CSGO, they're not brand friendly even in the slightest. So these esports arenas don't make money. They're getting way more investment than they can actually sustain. And things like OWL and LCS and now the Call of Duty League are trying to grow exponentially, but they're not taking the time to support the industry that will organically go up with it. And as a result, there's a lot of money being infused, and there's going to be a lot of money that comes out when it crashes. So anyone that says that esports is not a bubble, I think is just not informed. There's just no way that it could be otherwise. Whenever you have a situation where there's going to be huge money coming into something and nobody is paying attention to how that money is actually being translated into a return on investment or value, you're going to have a correction. So FGC played it smart? Yeah, I mean, really smart comment, dude. Like in more ways than you can imagine. FGC is very smart. FGC is not really taking on investment. There are independent esports teams in there like Panda Global that are getting sponsored, and they're actually cash flow positive. And esports teams in the FGC community are supporting individual players who are organically raising with their sponsorship value. So FGC won't see a correction at all. Is there a way to make esports successful without a bubble? Yeah, I mean, you could just grow organically with the industry. You don't have to make it like these big production events. The fact that Bobby Kotick went and tried to sell everybody that Overwatch was worth $15 million or $25 million a slot is like the problem, right? Is that like you've got these kind of like greedy companies and CEOs coming in and VCs that are trying to make this a thing before it's a thing. So there's a thing called market adoption, right? And market adoption takes time. If you want to get people used to your product and get people using your product, it takes time. It takes time to get used to electric cars. It takes time for people to switch from candles to electricity. It takes time to switch from horse to Model T. The product might be superior in the moment, but it's not superior. The market adoption just isn't there. It takes a lot of time for that adoption to happen. And what the people in esports did was they ignored the time that it takes. They ignored the fact that you have to inform that market, and they instead just pushed it in their face. Well, the market's not going to respond fast enough. Advertisers aren't going to convert, and we're going to have a correction. And I think anybody that really like looks at this and follows the esports scene enough is going to see this, right? I'm not saying that esports is going to crash, and I also think that it's very possible that esports might actually be something like sports in the future. I just put a very long tail on it. Consumer behavior happens a lot slower than most companies want it to happen. And for consumers to adapt to something new takes a lot of time. So when you force it like this, you're going to have a lot of money that's sort of like, the way I would describe it is like, you know, old weird flex, but okay. You know that old, like the Matrix Revolutions when like the drill comes through the hole and all the machines spill out and it's like all the gunfire is going on the machines. The initial machines all fall off. But then like the future machines get in and they actually succeed, right? It'll be the same thing as like the people that came in first, I think in this case, are going to take the brunt of the damage. And then like the future people that are making intelligent and organic investments will actually progress. Even with the correction due to the massive investment, do you think the growth rate of this industry benefited? Yeah. Yeah, at the cost of tens of millions of dollars of dumb money, it certainly did. But I think there was probably a better way to do it. The problem is that a correction can do a lot of damage, right? So a bad enough correction can slow the growth of or totally stagnate an industry for 10 to 20 years, which is a long ass time. So the reason why people don't think about corrections in this day and age is because we've had it good for a very long time. The markets have been incredible for the last many, many years. And nobody really knows what a market correction feels like anymore, but it is some serious shit when that goes down. So the problem with corrections, and the reason why it's like, well, why can't we just use corrections in order to foster the growth of an industry? Well, it's because the feedback scares people. And so if advertisers and brands and VCs do nothing in esports for the next 15 years, and esports just stagnates, that has a lot of implications for the gaming industry, for Twitch itself, as well as esports, right? That's not a very good thing. So if we get, I don't know how big the correction is going to be. I think it's going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But if the correction is scary enough, and it takes even 5 years for the next investor to put money into it, that is very scary, right? You see why that's very scary. I just got here. Do you think the way Dota 2 has grown its competitive scene is in a good way? Yes, I do. Very good comment. I do think that's true. And I also think that the way that Epic Games and other crowd-sourced or community-sourced platforms are doing esports is the correct way. When I criticize esports, the main thing I criticize is the leagues. I think it's I criticize franchise leagues for so many reasons. I think franchising was the worst thing to happen to esports, most likely. It had some positives, but it's a very bad thing overall. It stifles creativity. It stifles content. It stifles new players from being able to get in. It makes content inherently boring. It stifles storylines. It makes esports much more about money and less about story. And I think it's overall a pretty bad thing. Esports will still exist, but if it's stagnated for multiple years, then that initial growth won't matter, because the trust in the industry will fall out, right? So I guess an analogy I could draw is look at cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency has always been pretty legit in terms of its actual technological or fundamental use case. Cryptocurrency is really exciting if you look into it for its applications to real life. It can do some really cool shit. But the problem with cryptocurrency is that it's so volatile that the market can't easily adopt it. So when we last saw the spike of Bitcoin went way up and then it crashed and it stagnated for quite a while. I think something like 8 months to 12 months, which is fast for cryptocurrency. But if you look at Bitcoin as a investment, it has had this kind of market cycle for a long time. So what happens is, and now we're just on the upswing again, right? So what happens with Bitcoin is that Bitcoin has these what's called head and shoulders, right? Where you have these long periods of time where it goes way up, and then it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down, then it goes up, then it goes down, right? And every time that it goes down, the market loses a bit of confidence until it goes back up again and the market gains confidence and it keeps going down. The result of this is that there are these long periods of stagnation where the market is not healthy because people are adverse to investing in the market. And this is my concern for esports. So the problem with this is when that's applied to the franchise leagues, you see, so that's not really a big deal if there's not a lot of money going into something. But when you can buy a franchise spot for $20 million, but the entire value of the sponsorships of the league itself is less than $1 million. That should scare a lot of people, right? For example, yes, it doesn't. It's just a question whether these head and shoulders lead to long-term growth. No. The problem is you've never been through a correction cycle. You don't know how bad it is. If you want to watch how bad this can get, watch Who Killed the Electric Car. And look what happens when investor confidence falls out from something. It took 30 years for electric cars to be recognized again. there are industries where that happens. So it can be, in the case of a lot of corrections and things like cryptocurrency, we see it points to long-term market growth, but it doesn't always. The situation could very easily be that esports takes a 30 to 40 year stagnation drop and just doesn't ever recover until a point where it's actually relevant again. That's what I'm trying to say. The problem with this statement is you're really, really underestimating what stagnation can do because you haven't seen it. And I'm telling you that like a market correction is some serious shit. You're trying to catch falling knives when you're trying to artificially inflate an industry like this. It could work, yes. It could lead to more long-term growth. I'm not denying that. I'm saying that I think I'm saying I think that what could just as easily happen is a very long-term stagnation period that would scare everyone. Al has sponsorships from Coca-Cola, Toyota, T-Mobile, HP, and Intel. Aren't those worth a lot? I'm sure they are. Do you think they're worth the buy-in from the league and the expenses those teams output? Does that seem intuitive to you? I can answer your question objectively, and I can tell you they are not equal, right? But you could just kind of like price it out, right? Do you think those 4 sponsors make up for the individual buy-ins alone of every one of those teams in terms of ROI? And just because they have T-Mobile as a sponsor, that doesn't mean that T-Mobile is sponsoring the league like they're sponsoring, I don't know, Formula 51 or whatever, right? Or Formula 1. Just because it's a big company doesn't necessarily beget that it's millions and millions of dollars of investment. I'm not saying it isn't, right? But just something to consider. The Coca-Cola, for example, I've dealt with Coca-Cola where they've made $10,000 investments in their activations. I've sold to Coca-Cola before. But none of that actually concerns me as much as just the raw fact. I think none of these, because we're getting into the theory stuff, but none of that is actually as interesting to me as the fact that they just don't sell product. That's the most interesting thing to me, right? And so even if they get some multi-million-dollar sponsorship or whatever, that person will pull out at the end of that next contract because the ROI isn't there. So at the end of the day, it just comes down to conversions, okay? Like if I'm going to sell you Essentia water and I say, hey guys, buy this water. It tastes really good. It's really more watery than water. I need to rely on the fact that at the end of the day, I can sell you that you're going to buy it, right? If I have 10 million viewers on this stream and then I keep trying to sell you water and not one of you buys it, okay? Then eventually it's going to be realized that I'm not a good investment. Even though I have those eyeballs, I'm not actually converting anything. And that's the real no one talks about hidden problem with esports is that these teams don't convert products and services well. They're not very good at calls to action compared to influencers. So it's just to put it very simply, it is if you have $500,000, I would spend it every day of the week on Facebook ads, Twitch influencers, Instagram influencers than I would actually sponsoring OWL. I would do that every day of the week. When you're spending that much, it's much more about recognition than conversion. Recognition has to lead to conversion at some point. So I'm going to ask you a question that sounds really obvious, right? But do you think that marketing companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars just to get recognition and brand awareness? The answer is yes, right? But what does that eventually lead to? The idea is that it leads to sales. So if it doesn't lead to sales, eventually those paid channels, that channel marketing has to move to other verticals, right? So the problem is if I spend $50,000 with an influencer and that leads to a certain degree of brand awareness that's trackable, and then I spend $50,000 with an Overwatch team and that leads to a certain brand awareness that's trackable, and my brand awareness generation is much higher on the influencer than it is on the Overwatch team, eventually I eliminate that channel. A lot of people use brand building as a meme here, but you may not completely understand the implications of why people invest for the idea of brand building, right? Impressions are not valuable unless they add to future conversions.